My name is Jen Forman Orth. I work at the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources. First of all, what is an invasive plant? I think it's important to define this because if you are a gardener, you know about things that we call weeds. Sometimes they call them like garden thugs. And that's mostly not what I'm going to be talking about today. Specifically, I'm thinking about non-native plant species, so species that aren't native to this part of New England that have spread on their own into what we call like minimally managed areas. So that's not the dandelions in your lawn, and it's not the poison ivy in your yard because that's a native species, as much of a pain as it can be. It's things that are impacting either the economy or the environment, causing harm by developing these like self-sustaining populations that can grow on their own without any kind of human interference. And then they become dominant and sometimes disruptive to ecosystems. So then we need to talk about what exactly makes a plant invasive. And this is the holy grail of invasive species ecology. If we could just figure out exactly what characteristics a plant has that would make it a successful invader, then it would be really easy for us to we'd be like, well, if this plant does this, then we're going to ban it. And this plant doesn't do that, so it's okay for you to plant it. But, people have gotten PhDs out of this topic and they still haven't quite figured it out. But we do have some characteristics that we know are commonly associated with invasiveness. For example, something that might seem obvious to you, a species that has high fruit or high seed production. And for me, the best example of this is Asiatic bittersweet. On the left, that's American bittersweet. It's a species that's native here and is even now listed as a species of special concern because of its rarity in Massachusetts. On the right, we have a photo of Asiatic bittersweet, the introduced species. The thing about American bittersweet is that it only puts out fruit at the ends of every vine, whereas Asiatic bittersweet puts out flowers and fruit at every axil where there's a pair of leaves along the stem. So much, much more fruit production. Another thing that we know is associated with invasive success is just the ability to reproduce vegetatively. So sometimes even a plant that doesn't often have viable seeds like Japanese knotweed, or that doesn't have high fruit production can still be a very aggressive invader. Here's a picture of the stem of Japanese knotweed, and a whole new plant is growing out of that. So if you think you're taking care of knotweed by mowing it down, you could actually be like the Johnny Appleseed of knotweed. You're just spreading chunks of it everywhere. Every chunk can grow into a new plant. Another characteristic associated with invasive success is plants that leaf out earlier in the season than their native counterparts or keep their leaves longer. So a good example of this is multiflora rose. On the left, that is a shot that I took in April. And you see the background is brown. That's because everything else there is dead except for the multiflora rose. So all the native species, they aren't growing yet, but the multiflora rose has already woken up and is putting out fresh leaves. So that gives it a longer growing season than a lot of native species. And then another thing to look out for, and this is a shot of glossy buckthorn from December, and those leaves are green. So a lot of times if you're in like a sort of a disturbed area, or if you're driving along a road and you stop in traffic, then, and it's like November or December, so frost has already come, and if you look out into the side of the road, anything that's green is almost certain, well, anything that's a green deciduous plant, not things like pine trees that keep their needles year-round. Anything that's deciduous that you see growing along the side of the road in December, if it's still green, it's almost certainly going to be a non-native species. Things like buckthorn, Norway maple is another good one. All of the other native maples will lose their leaves, but Norway maple is still going strong often into November. Another characteristic that is associated with successful invasiveness is the ability for a plant to alter the environment in a way that gives it an advantage and sometimes other species a disadvantage. The best example of this is what we call allelopathy. There are a lot of different species that basically are exuding chemicals from their roots that poison the soil to any plants that aren't that species. The best non-native example of that is Japanese barberry. If you see patches of barberry, you'll see there's often nothing growing underneath the barberry except other barberry. Black walnut is a plant native to the Northeast that also has that ability. There's also things like autumn olive that actually, it's not a legume, but it fixes nitrogen in the soil, which is really great for the autumn olive, but not great for the native plants that are used to having nitrogen poor soil. So it's just a way of that plant giving itself an advantage over a native species. Some of the other characteristics that they've found associated with invasive success are the ability to just thrive under a wide variety of conditions. It's pollution tolerant, it's shade tolerant, but it also can grow in full sun. It grows in dry soil, but it also grows in moist soil. A lot of times, these are the kinds of things that people look for when they're trying to plant things, especially around their house, if they're not experienced gardeners, because you want something that's low maintenance or that has a low risk of dying. But unfortunately, those kinds of things are often associated with invasiveness. Also, the idea that when a species is introduced from one country or continent to another, that typically the pests that attack it and the fungal pathogens that would normally attack it in its native range don't come with it. This is something called the enemy release hypothesis. It has been shown to give invasive plants an advantage, but it's not itself like a guarantee. It's just like correlated positively with invasiveness. Okay, so what are we doing about this ecological threat? We have something called the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group, or I'm going to refer to it as MIPAG because it's a mouthful. It first met in the late 1990s. It's made up of representatives from federal and state government, also conservation groups, folks from academia, so researchers, folks from the nursery industry, really important to have their buy-in, weed scientists, horticultural folks, and agricultural folks. Basically what they did was they met and they determined what we call a risk assessment procedure. So what are the things that we need to know about a species to evaluate it for its invasiveness? And it's this like long 3-page document. You can access that document at the website here. You can use the QR code. I will make sure that everybody that needs to has all the links from the slides. We can email them out to folks so that you can have them. So don't worry if you miss this. But you can also just search for Mass Invasive Plant Advisory Group on Google and it will get you to the right place. So here's the process for risk assessment. There is this giant list compiled of non-native plant species that are thought to be invasive. This list comes from botanical experts. It comes from nearby states that have species on their list that aren't on ours. It comes from a great research lab at UMass Amherst that is doing, it's called RISK. They are looking into climate change impacts on invasive species. So the idea that a species that is a successful invader south of us right now could be a problem for us in 10, 20, 30 years from now. A species gets picked from that list and gets run through a risk assessment using over a dozen criteria, including things like the biology of the plant. Is it an herb? Is it a woody species? Is it evergreen? Its distribution in Massachusetts already. Its history of invasiveness any place else in the world, including the Northeast US. And then it gets ranked based on its score as either just it's invasive, so that's things like Japanese knotweed, but it also might be like likely invasive, so it's here, but it doesn't seem to be showing invasive tendencies yet, but we're worried about it. Or it could be what they call potentially invasive, so that's something that isn't known here in Massachusetts yet, but we've heard about it being invasive elsewhere, and that gives it a level of concern for us. Once something gets ranked according to the risk assessment, the full MIPAG group has to discuss it and vote. And that's why it's important that we have this buy-in from the nursery industry. So even if the science says, this is what we think it's invasive, there's still going to be some discussion among folks about whether it makes sense to list it or not. So this was just an advisory group, but we wanted to sort of codify this list at the state agency level. So in 2005, my agency proposed creating what we call the prohibited plant list, using all of the species that MyPAG had recommended at the time. So this was back, wow, 20 years ago. So there were a lot of species from that first round on the list, and also the federal noxious weed list, which is mostly things that you've never heard of. But we just wanted to have it on there, like if this ever shows up here, like it's prohibited, don't start planting with it just because you are interested in it. It's about 140 species total at the time. And then the next year, MDAR began prohibiting all of the plants on that list from being sold or imported or propagated in Massachusetts. There was like a phase out period so the nursery industry could get rid of their existing stock of some of the big ones like Norway maple and burning bush. That phase out period has long since ended. MyPAG continues to evaluate new species, but the funding they got 20 years ago isn't around anymore. And so it's happening very slowly on like a volunteer basis. They periodically reach out to my agency with suggested species that should be added to the list. To get the latest list, go to mass.gov, and in that giant search window, just type in prohibited plant list. It will get you there. Here's just some quick recent additions to the prohibited plant list. Calorie pear. It was a recent addition. There's been evidence for a long time that this species is invasive, but we knew there was going to be some pushback because a lot of growers sell this plant. It's very common in big box stores. It gets planted as a street tree sometimes. So that was listed in September of last year. There's a 3-year phase-out period for existing stock because it's a tree. We have a longer phase-out period for the big woody plants. So that'll be no longer to be able to be sold as of January 2029. There's an exception for folks that are growing fruit trees for selling produce, because sometimes fruit pears are grown using a rootstock of calorie pear. So you're still allowed to plant a grafted pear fruit tree, but if the graft fails, then you have to remove the calorie pear rootstock and get rid of it, because it's known that if the graft fails, that the calorie pear will just take over, and we don't want that. And then just another quick note, MyPAG has recently been talking about putting Chinese silvergrass or Miscanthus sinensis on the list, but they've been asking for more information from folks. Now, if you spend any time on the Caper Islands of Massachusetts, you will see this plant growing wild everywhere. But folks want more information about whether you are seeing Chinese silvergrass growing not in your yard and not from a planting, but like in a wild area where it could only have started from seed. So if you have seen evidence of this, they would like you to provide them with more information. Again, there's a QR code there. So now I just kind of want to focus in on Sterling for a while and just talk about like what, I was trying to figure out, I've got a long list of species I talk to people about, but I don't want to come here and talk to you about something that's only really a big problem on the Cape. So I always try to figure out like what for Sterling, what is going to be the focus. I went on to, does anybody here use the iNaturalist website? Thank you. We love when people contribute data to that citizen science database. So what I did was I went into iNaturalist.org and I searched for introduced plant species in Sterling, Massachusetts, and this is the map that came up. And then I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the heck this part of Sterling is, because nobody is posting observations from there. And it looks like there's some conservation land, and then I couldn't just really figure it out. I don't know if it's just not accessible or if it's just so beautifully forested and pristine that there are no introduced species in there. Maybe. Here is the top 10 list from most observations in iNaturalist to least. The number one was glossy buckthorn. Honestly, I was kind of surprised because people don't often notice that, but somebody seemed to be into that in Sterling. And I was surprised to see greater celandine on the list, because that's not something we hear about very often at my agency. But But I did notice that, I mean, there's not a lot of active users submitting observations on iNaturalist from Sterling. So when we got down to here, it was like 3 observations. And so I wanted to just kind of open it up and see, like, is this being skewed by the lack of data? This is the same list, but for all of Worcester County on iNaturalist. And you'll see that you see some of the same species, but the order changes. So Asiatic bittersweet was the most common species, but greater celandine was still on there. So I did add a little bit about that species in there into the presentation. We're not going through all of these. And again, part of that is because I was selfish and I saved some time to talk about species that I want you to know about that you probably haven't seen yet. But I did want to talk about glossy buckthorn. I find this to be an incredibly pervasive invasive species. It really manages to grab a hold in natural areas. It likes moist soil, but it's fine in dry soil. It's a shrub or a small tree. And so when it takes over, you will see that it eventually, it'll take over gaps and you won't have a giant shaded area anymore because it's just kind of all glossy buckthorn. Glossy buckthorn can be recognized by its ovate leaves, so oval shaped, with very prominent veins along each leaf. This is a species that's native to Eurasia and parts of Africa. It was introduced to North America in like the mid 1800s, long time ago, for its, people appreciated it as an ornamental plant. They didn't know about invasive species back then. And also for wildlife habitat. Here is a photo I took of a chipmunk helping spread buckthorn by eating the berries and then eventually probably depositing the seeds somewhere. Glossy buckthorn spreads by those seeds, but it also can sucker, which makes it really hard to get rid of. So if you think you can just get rid of glossy buckthorn by cutting it down, it's going to produce 1 or more shoots from wherever you cut it if you aren't doing something else. Glossy buckthorn has fairly inconspicuous flowers. They're white 5-petaled flowers that are kind of, the petals are very thick and they're joined. They're connected across the corolla of petals. One of the things that's interesting about glossy buckthorn is that it can have flowers, unripe fruit, and totally ripe fruit all in the same shrub. So it starts flowering very early, and some of the fruits will start to mature, but it keeps putting out more flowers for several months. So you have massive fruit production. You can see the reddish berries aren't ripe yet, the black ones are. And then here, for some winter ID tips, we have glossy buckthorn over on the right, we have black cherry in the middle, and then we have common buckthorn, also an invasive species, all the way on the left. You want to look for these little marks here, these white, they sort of look like sets of lips. They're called lenticels. They're like a breathing mechanism for the tree for like gas conductance. The other thing you can do with glossy buckthorn is you can scrape the bark off, and if it's glossy buckthorn, it's bright orange underneath the bark, but I sort of hesitate to give you a destructive method of ID like that, because if you're wrong, then what did you just do to some other tree, right? So here's a fun fact about glossy buckthorn. Again, it's a pain to control, but you can do mechanical removal, so just like pulling it or digging it out of the ground. You can, honestly, the easiest thing to do is to just cut it down at the base, but then paint it with an herbicide like something with glyphosate or triclopyr. But I know people either don't want to or sometimes can't do herbicide application. So they do have these really cool things. I love the name. They're called buckthorn baggies. You cut the plant down and then you cover the cut trunk or stem with, it's like a trash bag with a cable tie. And then you just leave it, and the plastic's very thick, so if anything suckers out or tries to regrow, it doesn't have any sunlight and it will eventually die. So this is a great non-chemical method of control, but of course, you're gonna have an area of your property that has a bunch of these baggies on it for like a year or more. All right, next species, Asiatic bittersweet. This is Asiatic bittersweet doing its thing all the way up some really tall white pine trees this is in Needham, Massachusetts. This is, like its common name suggests, it's native to Asia. It was introduced to the US, again, well over 100 years ago as an ornamental plant. The fact is that, in the mid 1800s, if you were poor, you were gardening for food pretty much, maybe for like herbal uses. If you were rich, you were gardening for showing off to your other rich friends, and anything that was being, collected across in Europe, or especially in Asia, where it was considered very exotic, was muchly desired by folks. And that's how we got a lot of these species here. So Asiatic bittersweet is a woody perennial vine, so it's going to come back every year. It has separate male and female plants, which I'll explain why that's important for ID purposes. Asiatic bittersweet, as it grows, will strangle or girdle any other plants that it's growing on, so it cuts off the conductive system. It can even pull down trees. You've probably seen it happen if you have it in your yard. You'll find it in pretty much any disturbed habitat. The seeds are spread by birds, but the roots can also grow vegetatively into new plants. Here's Asiatic bittersweet doing its thing there's a tree under there somewhere, right? But it's eventually going to die, and that's for two reasons. One is that if all of your leaves are covered with Asiatic bittersweet leaves, then you can't photosynthesize. So that's more like a slow, painful death. But at the same time, as Asiatic bittersweet vines grow around either themselves or other trees, they're slowly squeezing. If you remove a Asiatic bittersweet from a tree where it's been there for a few years, you're going to see like dents in the tree as it just pulls it tighter. And again, that's so the conductive system of the tree is just inside the bark layer. That's where water and nutrients are going up and down. So it's really easy to cut that circulation off if you're squeezing very tightly. Let's talk about Asiatic bittersweet ID for a couple minutes, mainly because I think that most people recognize it by the fruits, and that would be fine, except that Asiatic bittersweet has separate male and female plants. So the male plants don't fruit, so you can't use that as an ID character. So take a look at these pairs of leaves. Again, they're ovate or oval, but they have these wavy margins on the leaves. Here's the plants in flower. The flowers, again, are very inconspicuous, especially compared to the fruits. If you look really closely, though, the males will have stamens and anthers and pollen, and the females will just have pistils with nectar on them. But what we really see for Asiatic bittersweet is, again, the fruits. They are these bright red, what we call arils, and then they have these orangey bracts behind them. It makes them very attractive to birds, but unfortunately, they're more like bird junk food. So they're mostly sugar, and they're lacking in the lipids and fats that birds should actually be eating before they're migrating for the fall. So in terms of control options, manual or mechanical control is possible, especially if the vine is still really skinny, you can just pull it out. I find it very therapeutic to cut Asiatic bittersweet at the base of where it's growing, like up a really big tree, and then as you can watch the leaves die, the plant dies. Feels really good. But the thing is a lot of times that base is going to regrow if you don't treat it. So in a lot of cases, folks will take something like glyphosate and just kind of paint it onto the stem. You need to be really careful. So sometimes cutting it down isn't really going to be an option, especially if the tree that it's attached to, if it's attached to a tree, has been weakened or maybe even dead. So you don't want to be pulling a big woody vine down out of something that could then come down on you or break a limb or something like that. So you need to be careful. In a lot of situations where stem cutting might not be possible, especially if it's really big, then sometimes people will do this like basil bark application where you just apply herbicide to the base of the woody trunk or stem of the vine, and then it will slowly kill it that way. So some fun facts about Asiatic bittersweet. Sale of bittersweet wreaths is illegal. Plastic vines not included. We get reports every year from people sending my poor coworker nursery inspectors to track down what ends up being like artificial plastic bittersweet that a nursery was selling in their flower arrangement section. But this was actually, I went and gave a talk very similar to this a long time ago out in Bristol County, and it was at a church, and these big, beautiful bittersweet wreaths live were hanging on the doors. I was just like, Good photo op, but not so great. So again, I mean, when the fruits are on there, these are viable. So no, you can't make decorations with them and sell them to people. It's prohibited. But also, if the bittersweet gets big enough, you can make some really wacky looking furniture with it. So let's talk about multiflora rose for a bit. This is like the bane of my existence on my property because I cannot go out into my yard without bleeding from this plant. You know, it's something about the thorns and the way that they're shaped. And this species also drives me crazy because it's the most misbehaved rose. It grows like a vine, it grows along the ground, it grows as a shrub. It's really hard to deal with. But right now, this is more what multiflora rose looks like. It produces clusters of tiny rose hips that animals love. You might see the green canes out there right now with what we call these recurved thorns, so that rather than sticking straight out, they're sort of curved, which I think is why they're always catching on my pants and on the skin of my arm and drawing blood. Multiflora rose, there's a lot of species that have that sort of multiflora inflorescence. So instead of having like a big, beautiful single garden rose, it's just small white or sometimes pinkish flowers in clusters, and each flower just has 5 petals on it. You'll find these along roadsides, in disturbed habitats, so like what we call edge habitat, like along a road or around a farm or places like that. It was introduced again back in the mid-1800s. You're seeing a pattern here, but this was actually being used as rootstock for ornamental roses. But then it was also being planted as an ornamental species and for erosion control, which led to it being spread to a lot of unmanaged areas. So the way you can recognize multiflora rose is to look for what we call feathery stipules. So again, tread cautiously, maybe wear gloves because the thorns are going to be along the main stem. But you see this is one leaf. It's a compound leaf, and all those little things that look like leaves are actually leaflets. But if you look at the base of each leaf, it has these little hairs that have hairs on them. For comparison, on something like a native swamp rose, there's typically, they're always going to have the stipules, but for the native species, they're wider. They're not like little feathery projections. For control options, honestly, frequent cutting or mowing, if you're able to do that, can be a really good way of knocking this plant back. But if you want to get rid of it and you can't like excavate everything, then really your only option is going to be applying glyphosate, a product with glyphosate, to the cut stems. Multiflora rose has a very long-lived seed bank. So once the fruits drop to the soil, the seeds in there could germinate anytime over the next several years. So this isn't a one and done thing. You have to keep going back and either cutting or pulling out the new plants that grow. But again, cutting and mowing is a good option for a plant where you aren't going to easily be able to pull it out because of all those thorns. Let's talk about Japanese knotweed. I did my thesis on this. This is kind of what we're looking at right now in terms of Japanese knotweed because the leaves have died back. An herbaceous perennial plant, so at the end of the year, everything above ground is going to die back and be dead and brittle. Once it starts to grow again in the spring, it comes up from, often you'll see the dead canes from last year and then the new growth. And when that starts to grow in like May or so, several inches a day will start to project from the ground. So Japanese knotweed was introduced to the US in the late 1700s, where it was being touted as a beautiful ornamental plant and also something really good to hold the soil, so erosion control if there was an area that had nothing planted on it and the soil was starting to crumble or wash away, and also for animal forage. And again, this is a long time ago, so the late 1700s. So they were just looking for cheap options that grew quickly that could feed grazing animals in an area. One of the very first introductions of knotweed was actually out at UMass Amherst. Japanese knotweed has hollow stems with nodes like bamboo, but it's not at all related to bamboo, which is actually a type of grass. And knotweed can reproduce by rhizomes, which are like an underground stem base where new shoots can pop up, but it also can reproduce by seed. And also, like I showed before with that photo, any part of the stem that has a leaf node on it, even if it's just like an inch tall, can grow into a whole new plant. You will find knotweed along roadsides, in wet areas. It prefers full sun, but it will kind of lay low in a shaded area until a gap opens up and then kind of go crazy. Here is knotweed doing its thing in asphalt. The force by which knotweed shoots come out of that rhizome base in the spring is enough to break through asphalt. I've seen it growing through concrete. Here's knotweed growing into someone's house because it was growing right outside on their foundation. Japanese knotweed, here it is in flower. It has millions and millions of little tiny white flowers. Here it is. This is what you're seeing right now. It gets kind of orangey when it dies. Here are the seeds. They are wind dispersed. And again, here's knotweed coming out of a highly disturbed area along the commuter rail. So in terms of controlling Japanese knotweed, if you have a small population of it, try to dig it out. If it's really big, then you can try mowing it to knock it back, but you basically need to mow it every week during the growing season for many, many years to really deplete it. You can use these control options in combination with each other. Some people even try this thing we call tarping, where you take an opaque tarp and put it over the area that has the knotweed, stake it down. Just make sure you don't pull the tarp really tight. You got to leave some room because when the knotweed stems come up, if it's tight, they'll just break right through because they can break through asphalt. But if they're loose, then when it pokes up, it'll just kind of sit there and it won't be able to photosynthesize because it doesn't get sunlight. This is just a fun fact about Japanese knotweed. UMass has been testing a knotweed biocontrol insect. Hasn't been going so well, so they're still in the research phase with it. But also the Franklin Park Zoo in Boston routinely feeds their giraffes knotweed. They absolutely love it, and there's plenty of it growing in Franklin Park. Garlic mustard, I did want to talk about this because I think it's a really common species along roadside edges, but also it's really good at making its way into hiking trails. A lot of people recognize garlic mustard by so it's in the mustard family, which has 4-petaled flowers, which isn't very common. It has these little sprays of 4-petaled flowers at the tops of the stems. This is the wrong time to be identifying garlic mustard. At the time where it's flowering, that's already too late. See this slide here? This is what we call like a basal rosette. So garlic mustard is a biennial plant. First year, you just get these low-growing leaves that are kind of have scalloped edges, and only in the second year does it bolt up and flower, and then once it flowers, it dies. Garlic mustard is called garlic mustard because it has really stinky, like garlic-scented foliage. It was actually brought here as what we call a potage herb. So folks are just growing it in their gardens to put into salads. So you can eat it if it's growing in an area that you think it has good soil. It does spread by seed. It has very tiny seeds that come out of that inflorescence at the top. Those seeds stick to your hiking boots. They stick to animal fur. So if you've got deer going through an area, you can also often see the deer path with the seeds popping up. And this is what happens if you have garlic mustard in a wet area that ever floods. So everything in that entire forest understory is now garlic mustard. In terms of dealing with garlic mustard, again, look for it. You could even look for it now. Basically, anytime you see those leaves in the ground, pull them out. If you don't miss it until the plants are already flowering, then you need to pull it out and dispose of it and not just leave it on site. Garlic mustard, if you pull garlic mustard out when it's already flowering and you just like leave it there, it will still produce viable seeds. So at the point where it's flowering, that is now your burden to like take with you and dispose of properly, not in compost and not throwing it into your pile in the backwoods. I do want to talk about greater celandine for a bit. I'm curious if anyone has seen this plant because that's sort of good and sort of bad. This is actually in the poppy family. It has really nice, beautiful yellow 4-petaled flowers. This was introduced again in the mid-1800s as an ornamental plant. It was once used very widely as herbal medicine in Europe. There are still some folks that have herbal uses for it. It's a short-lived perennial. It prefers moist and very disturbed soils. and the seeds are actually spread by ants. These are the seed pods. And then I just think this is really cool. So here are the seeds inside the seed pods. This is called an eleosome. And if you're an ant, this is like the absolutely most delicious thing in the world. So ants will just crawl up and carry those seeds away as soon as they pop open. Greater celandine has very shallow roots. So the easiest thing to do is to just pull it out. Wear gloves if you're dealing with greater celandine. I'll explain why in a couple more slides. You can also dig the plants out if you need to. If you're going to do it, honestly, I wouldn't recommend a chemical application because the leaves are what we call like hydrophobic. So it's really hard to get water to stick to them. It just kind of rolls off like when you put that Rain-X stuff on your car. So you would have to apply like an extra surfactant to make the chemicals stick to the plant. So some fun facts about greater celandine. There's a double-flowered variety that also is invasive. I've seen it growing in Concord. The plants exude a yellow sap that can be toxic and can be an eye irritant. I learned about this through a grad student that was giving us a tour of plants and then rubbed her eye, and then she just had yellow stained on the white of her eye. So here's just some general advice, because we can't talk about all the plants today that we want to talk about. For a lot of species, you really need to time management before the plant sets seed. And that's for things like garlic mustard, but also for things like black swallowwort if you're dealing with that. If you wait until black swallowwort pods are like mature, then you're going to be getting like seed dispersal everywhere. And you don't want that. So for the smaller herbaceous plants, you probably want to plan to be doing that earlier in the season. If you have woody invasives like glossy buckthorn or even burning bush like big or shrub honeysuckle, anything that has a single stem base, you can use the power of the lever to remove plants like this from the environment. So this works for a lot of different woody species. This is one option called an uprooter. There's also something called a weed wrench. Just Google tools like weed wrench out there. Basically, this is a big metal pole, and at the bottom, it has a clip that you can screw tightly onto the base of any stem of a plant you're trying to get rid of. And then you just pull the lever back, and the whole thing just comes out with you. Giant hogweed, next slide. That's my tall coworker, Trevor. Just to give you an idea about why giant hogweed is called giant hogweed. This is, again, something that was brought here because it was a weird ornamental looking plant for estate gardens. This is a biennial or short-lived perennial that can get up to 20 feet in height when it flowers. Once it's introduced, it's going to be spread by its seeds that are in the seed bank in the soil, by people disposing of yard waste with hogweed seeds, or by flooding or soil erosion in wetter areas where it has invaded. This is a federal noxious weed due to its phototoxic sap. So this is what happens when you get exposed to giant hogweed sap, but it's phototoxic. So first you have to get the sap on your skin, and then you have to have your skin exposed to sunlight. So we always suit up in Tyvek when we're dealing with this particular pet. Here is a map of every place where we have giant hogweed here in Massachusetts. No place that close to here. Giant hogweed ID. First of all, giant leaves that are very deeply lobed and have pointed teeth on them. A stem that is green with purple splotches on it and then has these like stubbly hairs dispersed on them, versus a native lookalike that still has hairs, but they're more like downy hairs, and this is solid green, this has got purple specks. Flowers look like Queen Anne's lace on steroids, so that's a pen for scale, and again, these are going to be growing like over your head high. I'm just going to say there's a lot of lookalikes. Do keep an eye out for wild parsnip. I have seen this moving east from New York. It doesn't look anything like hogweed to me, but if you see something that looks like Queen Anne's lace, but it has yellow flowers, this again can have like phototoxic sap issues. So you don't want to get this on your skin. So be careful if you're mowing in that area. This is one of few species that my agency is actively trying to manage in Massachusetts. So we keep track of every place where we know it's growing. We are working with landowners to manage some of the sites. And sometimes if we get grant money, we hire contractors to go out and treat. You know, it's in the carrot family. It has a taproot. So if it hasn't started to flower yet and you can get in there without exposing your skin to the sap, you can slam a shovel into the taproot and just sever it from the base, and it will die. Otherwise, really, you're going to need to either dig it out, which is a pain, or you just really, because you don't want to get near this plant. We typically do glyphosate treatment to control it, but you need to time it for before the plants start to flower, because if the plant matures and the fruits mature and they fall to the ground, now you've got like 6 years of checking the site because the seeds could still be germinated. Don't do any management of hogweed. Well, first of all, tell the state, but second of all, without proper protective equipment on. I want to talk to you about mile-a-minute vine, called mile-a-minute because it grows several inches a day at its peak growth point. This is a fast-growing and aggressive but annual vine, which becomes important for its our management capabilities, but again has a long-leaved seed bank. So once the fruits drop to the soil, you're checking that site for 5 or 6 years to make sure that you really got rid of the mile-a-minute vine. This is a plant that prefers open, disturbed areas. It has a vining growth form, but it's annual. It doesn't get woody, so it's going to kind of grow across things and up a little bit, but it's not like bittersweet where it's going to get all the way to the top of a pine tree, because when frost hits, it just dies. It really likes edge habitat. So you're going to find it along rivers and roads, and we've seen it showing up at a lot of farms recently. So mile-a-minute vine is one of the few plants where I can say it actually wasn't brought here on purpose, as far as we know. It showed up as a contaminant in shipments of other plants from across the ocean, and it first showed up in Pennsylvania back in the 1930s. Now that it's here, it's getting spread around in the transport of soil, in when farms share equipment with each other and don't clean it off. It also moves in water, and wild animals are unfortunately sometimes eat the fruit. Here is a map of every place we have mile-a-minute vine. We kind of lost the battle in this one, I think. At this point, we're kind of managing some of the smaller sites, but we're not going to eradicate it. Here it is growing along the edge of a road. Here it is growing in Fowl Meadow in the Blue Hills Reservation in the Milton-Dedham area. So the entire understory is mile-a-minute vine, and then under the mile-a-minute vine is dead mile-a-minute vine, and then under that is more dead mile-a-minute vine. It's just a carpet. You can ID mile-a-minute vine by looking for perfectly triangular leaves, like equilateral triangle. You can look for these small curved barbs along the stems. Like, it's not like a thorn. You can still hold it, but it doesn't feel comfortable. If it's fruiting, it's really easy to ID, right? It has these bizarre, brilliant metallic blue fruits. There are a lot of lookalikes, but again, perfectly triangular leaves and barbs along the stem should be enough for you to narrow it down. If you're not sure, you can report it to us. The good thing about mile-a-minute vine is it's an annual. So if you find it and it hasn't fruited yet, you can pull it out and you can just leave it there and it'll just die. It's not gonna like re-sprout or anything like that. If you miss that window, then again, now that biomass is your responsibility to deal with. So you're either bagging it or burning it or basically getting it off the property, because those fruits are going to all generate into new plants. We do recommend that folks avoid spreading around fill that might be contaminated with mile-a-minute vine. And if you're working in an area with mile-a-minute vine, that you clean off your equipment before it goes to another site. We did have a biocontrol program where we were releasing these, I'm going to say adorable little weevils, but that's me with bugs. Bugs are cool. We released them in several sites, and they've shown up across the state somehow. They are not doing a really good job at getting rid of the mile-a-minute vine, and we don't know why. It could just be that it's a little bit too cold up here. They were doing really well down in Delaware, where they also have mile-a-minute vine. Kudzu in Massachusetts. When invasive plants are bad here, you'll see someone will write an article and say it's the kudzu of the north, but we actually have kudzu here, so I wouldn't use that phrase anymore. Kudzu is a legume, so like beans, it has these what we call trifoliate leaves. So each leaf has 3 lobes in like a sort of a triangle shape. This is a semi-woody perennial vine. It's very rapidly growing. If you've heard of kudzu in the South, you know that already. It produces primarily by either rhizomes, so underground stems, or runners, sort of like strawberries, where the stems grow right along the ground above ground. This was introduced to the US in the late 1800s again as something for erosion control. And as is often the case with something that is touted as something to control erosion, it's really hard to get rid of, and it grows in a lot of places you don't want it. It was first discovered here in the 1980s. This is a map of where we know it is now, or where it's been found. And that's it, just in the eastern part of Massachusetts. And here's just some more ID tips. So look at the kudzu leaf. Again, it kind of looks like beans, right? Like a bush bean leaf. But if you look here, you see that the little, so this is one leaf, and those are 3 leaflets. And each leaflet has a little stem that attaches it to the main leaf, and that's called the petiole. On the bottom 2 lobes, they're short, and then in the middle, the top one has a really long stem or petiole. So that's a good ID character. You can also look for, again, stipules, like with multiflora rose. They're long and they have brown hairs all over them. And sometimes you'll see the whole kudzu stem has noticeably like rusty brown hairs on it. When it flowers, you get these spikes of purple grape-scented flowers. I'm not kidding. It smells like grape soda. It's really weird. I actually found an infestation down in Sandwich by smelling the flowers and like searching where the plants were. And then it produces these fuzzy brown seed pods that they look like beans. So we are actively managing this towards eradication. We have eradicated Marblehead, the town of Marblehead has eradicated their own population. We are working on the Kingston site is almost eradicated. We've eradicated from one of the Needham sites. We have been doing this with a combination of hand removal and herbicide treatments. So this was Needham, Mass. in 2011. This is all kudzu. We don't know exactly what happened. It looked like one of the people who lived there for a very long time before he passed away was an avid gardener and introduced it to his location, and then it just kind of took over. So we went in there and did a foliar spray of everything we could reach, and then anything that was growing up into the trees we cut at the base, and we treated the base of the stem with glyphosate as well. So in 2012, we had fairly good control. You can still see some of it over here, but we can also see, and this is how life works, right? We have now created an erosion issue on this hill. So we planted some ryegrass there. It sort of took and sort of didn't, but the hill held. And you can see after 2014, we found just like one little kudzu runner way down here. As of 2020 and still going, new person has moved into the house. They probably have no idea that kudzu was ever here. They've just got a nice little trampoline and they're having a backyard and a lawn and living their best life with no kudzu there still. Quick note about boxwoods. Boxwoods are not prohibited, but just a quick note because we have a pest called box tree moth on Cape Cod and as far west as Plymouth, the city of Plymouth. If any of you have seen your boxwoods shrubs getting decimated, please look for signs of that moth or that black and green and yellow striped caterpillar and let me know. What can you do to help control invasive species? Besides checking the properties that you live on or work on, please raise awareness about invasive plants in your area with your colleagues and with your neighbors. Prevent invasive plants from getting established when you can, because we all know that once something gets a hold, it's a lot more time and resources and money to get rid of it, and sometimes you just can't even realistically get rid of it, right? Keep informed about high priority plant invaders. You learned about 3 today. Giant hogweed, kudzu is in Massachusetts, and Mila minute vine, so that you know about them. Report any suspicious plants to us at our website, massnrc.org/pests. I do recommend, if you're interested in invasive insects and plants and things like that could be impacting your yard or the places that you love to hike in and enjoy in the outdoors, to subscribe to our monthly pest newsletter. It is just a quick once a month, 4 or 5 bullet points. It's really easy to read, and it will keep you updated when we find a new pest in your area. You can also check our pest dashboard to see maps of some of the species that I talked to you about today.